Great. We're now started, so you can go ahead.
Great. Good afternoon, everybody. I'd like to welcome you to this second installment of our webinar series to support the implementation of student surveys in our innovation pilot. I'm really thankful for the people at My Student Survey, Ryan Balch, who has really gone above and beyond to support these efforts. So without further ado, Ryan, take it away.
Great. Thank you, Anthony. I'm happy to support the great work you guys are doing for evaluation within New Jersey and trying getting a lot of people involved in rolling out the process. So our last part in the series, we talked about the development of student surveys. This session will be primarily on administration tips. And then the third one in the session that's scheduled for next month will be looking at professional development. So to start with today, in terms of survey administration tips, what we're going to go through today is some different topics and questions that will come up as you go through a student survey administration. Some of the primary ones we'll talk about today are what is the best time to administer the surveys in terms of time during the calendar year. Should you use online or paper? What grade levels should you survey? Should you include open-ended questions on the survey? What teachers should have their students take the survey?
Okay, everybody, at this time is you're on bus 22. Bus 22 to the cafeteria. Bus 20.
And then finally, if looking at how many classes you should actually survey. So if there are questions that are coming up as we go along, please feel free to ask. So the overall considerations as we go through these questions is that many of the questions are going to depend on the goals for what you're doing in student surveys as well as district context. So I'm going to try to outline what are some different aspects of why you should make the decision. A lot of it is a conversation with the district to say, where are you at? What are you hoping to accomplish? And here are the different pros and cons of each different decision, and we'll walk through it. So, and then there are other questions as well that are involved in survey administration. Just helpful to have that guidance as you go through on some of those questions. So the first question we're going to talk about is the time to administer the survey. The best student surveys, they ask questions about the frequency of behavior or how often these behaviors occur. And the reason they do that is because it's the idea of something called a low inference behavior. So when somebody's trying to evaluate the quality of a person's review at the end of class, it may vary from student to student. But something that students are really have a high capacity for is the frequency of it. And in fact, they're the best judge of the frequency because they're in the classroom every day. When we use these types of behaviors, get a higher level of reliability. Now, these types of questions, you want to make sure that students have been in the classroom for at least a minimum amount of time to understand what is the day-to-day, what is the norm of the classroom. So we would recommend that you have at least 32 hours of instruction. And what that works out to is about 2 months if you're looking at 4 hours of that class per week. And so then you can kind of vary it from there, where if you have more instructional time due to block scheduling or less based on it being elective, it kind of allows you to get that target of that's the approximate time you're looking for, and you can base your timing during the year off of that. Often people do both a first semester one as well as a second semester one. The most common timings we do are about the 3 weeks before Thanksgiving, as well as in the spring at times that work out with all the testing schedules. So the second question I want to go through is the idea of using online or paper surveys. Obviously, the biggest factor in this is access to technology. Huge variance where some schools have a 1-to-1 computer ratio and some have one computer lab. So with paper surveys, the costs are higher, the turnaround time's longer, and there's additional logistics to figure out for distributing and returning the survey. Having said that, if there's going to be a higher burden on schools trying to use a limited amount of technology, the paper route may make the most sense. The other thing that a lot of people sometimes don't realize is that you can have, even if you had one computer lab, or a small limited access to technology, what you can do is you can spread that time over several weeks. So you might be able to have a 3-week or 4-week survey window. You could have one class a day take the survey and have enough time to be able to work through that. So technology sometimes can be a limiting factor, but there are ways to really maximize what is there already. The third question is really talking about what grade levels you should survey. There hasn't been research out that confirms the validity of surveys in grades K through 2. We don't offer one for that reason. I think there's some potential for some structured interviews and some group interviews with students at that grade for feedback purposes, but at this point, K through 2 has not seen the research. And this comes from it doesn't perform well in test retest. When you ask cognitive validity, means like when you ask students these questions, they may not be able to interpret what it means, and it doesn't have the correlation with student achievement. So without those, you don't have as much evidence for surveys in K through 2. Grade 3 is really the transition year. And you'll talk to a lot of third grade teachers, and they'll tell you the same thing about in a lot of different areas. But it's a transition year in terms of there are lots of third graders that really do well on student surveys, and there are some that don't. One of the things that can really help with that is having access to audio technology within the survey. And what this means is that you might have, I'm going to show you an example of this in one of our surveys, is that when you have some of the questions for younger students in particular, this also works really well with students with accommodations, ELL students, and so forth. You can have audio functionality built into the survey so that when they have the question, they can, you can see that they have an audio function that comes along with it. That can really help it when you're trying to do surveys within grade 3, because it really comes down to a reading comprehension level. So now I'll move on to the fourth question. Fourth question deals with whether you should include open-ended questions. And there's potential, and when I say an open-ended questions, a lot of times this looks like, what are 2 things that your teacher does really well, and what are 2 things your teacher could improve on? Some teachers find this to be some of the most helpful parts of all of the feedback, because it's really about their specific class. They can tell them about the activities they did. They can tell them about the amount of time they spent on different labs, or whatever it is, the specific techniques of that teacher's classroom can be addressed. So some teachers really find it meaningful for their practice when they hear the students' words. The flip side of that is that it's a Pandora's box where you can really, at that point, it's hard to screen out some potentially, harmful responses or vulgar feedback. We have screens that we can remove curse words and things like that, but in terms of context, there's the downside that there's still students taking the survey, and they, might use this as a chance to express other opinions, or it might be irrelevant, or whatever it is. So there's some pros to it and some downsides, and it's really about being able to figure out what's the best situation for your district and how many schools you have, and so forth. So, and just to give you an example of it, this is an example of a feedback report, and you can see the comments, it can be right within the feedback report. That you can have strengths as well as areas of improvement for student comments that are put in there. So those are some things that people find really helpful, but again, it's knowing the pros and cons of it as you're making that decision. The fifth question to talk through is what teachers should have their students take the survey. There are all ranges of different types of teachers and definitions within a school. Sometimes a librarian might teach a few classes. Sometimes a counselor might come in and co-teach a couple different times. And so there's always that. It doesn't make sense for students to take the survey about this teacher. So this is an example of criteria that we use with districts that will allow them to really differentiate it, because it's hard to say, well, special education does and music teachers don't, or whatever it is, because there's so many variations at every single school about what the actual function is that teacher is doing. So the 3 criteria we try to have the teachers meet is these three pieces. And that number one, they plan instruction. Number two, they deliver instruction. And number three, they either assign grades or they collaborate in the assignment of grades. If a teacher is meeting these three definitions, that really helps decide, is this the type of situation where it's going to be meaningful for that teacher to have student surveys be taken about them. And this is generally we use this in a lot of different places, and it's a fairly easy piece for people to understand. It really helps them in making those decisions at the school level. The next question I want to get to is thinking about how many classes you should survey. So there's a balance where you don't want to have students have to take the survey over and over and over and over again, but you want to make sure that you have validity. Now, what we've seen in our research is that once you get to about 18 to 20 surveys, the overall scores really aren't impacted that much by additional surveys. You probably have seen something like this when, as you're a teacher and you get near the end of the semester and you're adding in additional homeworks or whatever it is, their grade of the student doesn't change that much. So once you've got this 18 to 20 responses, it doesn't really impact it when you add a whole lot more students. Now, having said that, that 18 to 20 gives you that validity, there are other pieces of the conversation. So it's not just, I don't want students to get overburdened by survey, and I want to make sure I have enough responses. You also have to think about the results. Now, a teacher, if you only use one class per teacher, often they can think that, well, that was my worst class, or this isn't representative of my teaching. Where if you're using something like 2 classes or 3 classes, even though that might give you more student responses than you might need, then it still allows that teacher to feel that the results are representative, which means they're more likely to take the results seriously, which means they're more likely to have those results actually lead to an impact or a change in practice. So there's several different factors in there. There is the validity, having that minimum response. Then there is, you don't want students to take the survey over and over again, but having somewhere in the ballpark of 2 to 3 classes is most helpful. And that's primarily applicable to middle schools and high schools. When we think about it at the elementary level, often the piece that makes the most sense is having them take it about their homeroom teacher, and then they could take it about one additional teacher. So if you have 3 fourth grade classes, you might have each of the fourth grade classes taken about their homeroom teacher, and have one fourth grade class taken about the music teacher, have one fourth grade class taken about the PE teacher, and so forth. That's a way that you can still make sure all teachers get results, but you're not having the students take it over and over and over again, and the teachers start to be able to feel that it's representative. So in terms of next steps, the real big piece is, these are the questions that, some of the big questions that come up during survey administration. And it's really getting everybody involved and on board with these types of decisions. So often it is a question of bringing in technology, especially when you're thinking about the online versus paper survey, union leadership, so that teachers feel that they're represented in making sure that these decisions are reflecting their views. Academics department in terms of what it's going to be used for, or how this is going to influence, how this is going to impact the academic day. A group of principals and teachers and so forth. All of them are affected by the outcomes of this decision. So having that input on the front end will really allow you to make a decision with all those factors considered. And then finally, it's also about pros and cons for your context. There are of all those different 6, we have recommendations that we generally make, and then there are also factors that are a part of every district and every state that has a different context, and so it's really about balancing those pros and cons with your given context to really come up with the best survey administration for your district. So these are the primary questions that I wanted to go through, and hopefully these will be able to help you with your survey administration. Please feel free to reach out with any additional questions you might have about some survey administration, or if you'd like to have any assistance with some of that survey administration. So I'm going to go ahead and stop the recording now.